Hi there, I'm Cathy Menzies, and on the morning of 9/11, I was working for a local hospital, and which was also doing forensics for the courts. So I went to submit a report to the Department of Social Services and then the court. I encountered someone who I thought, had known in the past, and he was saying something about a plane and hitting, and I was like, "Oh, he's not well." And I drove over to the court with, you know, my music on and beautiful blue day, to arrive to the SWAT team on top of the court. So I knew something was incredibly wrong. So I pulled over to give my report because the judge needed to have it. I was met with a lot of resistance. Sort of started to fill me in on, plane hit the towers, and it just didn't compute. But I got the report in, and I traveled over to our office, which was in Suffolk County at that time. So there was a Nassau office and a Suffolk, and I was in the Suffolk office, going to the Suffolk office. And on the way, I started listening on the radio, and it was just unimaginable, like, you know, sort of, just how they were explaining things, and then the second tower. And when I got to the office, um, my one colleague, it was she and I in that office, she was a psychologist. We sort of, embraced and hugged and was like, what is going on in the world? Like, our own stuff. And then, the phone rang, and it was one of our administrators indicating that we needed to activate and be responders for families. Um, what did that mean? Like, what were we going to do? Like, so they gave us a setup at a local hotel, but gave us pretty much little information. Nobody knew information. Everything was sort of, so even driving over to the hotel, it was just like quiet and deserted. Like people were, starting to flee off the streets. And we did receive many, many families that day, and sat with them, although they were highly emotional and concerned, and was told, apparently, or believed, that we had information about their loved ones. So it was over and over, like, we don't have the information, we're getting information as you're getting information. So it was, definitely crisis intervention, and trying to stabilize, trying to, help them maybe reach another relative to sort of be with them, make decisions on where they were going to go. Some stayed and just, connected with other families. To this day, I can still see many of those people, and each year you hear their words, their name, their mostly children, or there was some husbands or wives, but most of it was children. So hearing those names read, and it's like having no connection, but some connection. So that was the initial, and we were there very late that night, and everyone filtered out finally, and I drove home, and to see the LIE just empty, to see all these roads just, and then the piece was that I grew up in a first responder family. So I had many friends and family that were there, which I had to sort of block out for the time that I was working, right? Like, because there really wasn't the opportunity to, Google on your phone or see this or that. There just wasn't. So it was really a real test to sort of just, and I remember getting home, flopping into the chair, and going on AOL Messenger, like, who has seen, who has heard, is this person okay, have you heard, talking to different people. You couldn't get through on a lot of the phones. It was late, so whoever was on, I was piecing information together, and And then for uh, some time after we were doing sort of that response work, it moved from Suffolk to JFK,
Mm.
to receive families, some international, making, trying to get interpreters. It just was a round robin of things. And even running into old colleagues at the JFK site, and like being glad they were okay, being glad their family was okay, people I hadn't seen in a couple of years, but like crisis like this, you know, unites people.
Yeah, definitely. And it's crazy to hear you say like AOL Messenger because what if you're thinking of it from today, you don't really realize that you didn't have that immediate communication. Like you if it happened today, you'd be on Twitter, it'd be on Instagram and videos
It'd
and
be
all of this
everywhere.
stuff. And so that's so interesting, like, that you didn't really know what was going on. There's no really means to really figure it out right away besides
Hmm.
radio and,
Right.
like, if you knew people.
And we
Yeah,
were
so
getting some of
crazy.
the information from some of the people coming in,
Yeah.
and like what was real and what wasn't, because they didn't set up a TV or a radio um, in there,
Were there any people who came in who, like, found their family member, or was it like, were there no moments of
N-
that?
Not at that point. No,
Yeah.
not at that point. No, not that initial, because those were the initial like 8 hours,
But
So I
at any
think
point were there, or was it?
so. Yes, because so some of the families that did receive service, uh, in the later weeks, yes, they had found their family. Some didn't. Some were just still, looking for any level of support they could get, or
Yeah.
receiving relatives from out of state or out of country. Um, and that's where we were there to sort of support. So it was a little bit of both by that time. And sort of we even try to keep those pieces separate on who is
Mhm.
running, just because, if it was my child, or my partner who didn't make it or wasn't found yet, from someone who was able to reunite with their family, and just having traumatic reactions to these events.
Right. I want to back up a little bit because I'm curious to your whole journey into the field of social work and trauma treatment and all of that. What inspired you to go into it in the first place?
It sort of fell upon me. So, younger life, I worked in the local town recreation department. I coached a synchronized swim team, was there for a million years, didn't know what I wanted to do. At first, thought I didn't want to go to college, but later I was like, wait, everyone's leaving, going to college, I better do something. So, it was a human service course that got me connected. We had to do like a little mini internship, got me connected to those in the Department of Social Service. And from there, it just kind of built. So at the time of 9/11, I was recently employed, probably about a year, um, and still had ties to my old child welfare job. I worked in a residential treatment center, had worked my way up, but by that time I had gotten my master's and wanted something more clinical. So I stepped out to the hospital, and I was still doing per diem, training new staff, things like that there. So, you know, being immersed in the trauma of foster care, adoption, children who have been abused, neglected, that was really a lot of my training for so many of those years. Then moving into the masters, putting together all the trauma work that I had done, that I was really afforded a lot of opportunities nationally and internationally to be trained in trauma. And so that was really sticking with me. Um, and then the transition really, I sort of well, next step would be I landed up 4 years later, um, getting involved with a 9/11 first responder, later
Mhm.
marrying him and the four children that came with him. Um, we had a fifth. We had a fifth later, but that again opened up the 9/11 experience because he served down there, and several of the family members. We did lose. I did lose, a few people then and a few people across the way, since. I think we spoke last time
Yeah.
about, I had just recently lost a very good friend at the age of 45. So, due
Mhm.
to 9/11 cancers and such. So, 6-year-old child, like, so this, yeah, is still impacting in so many ways. So I married into that, continued a little bit with the trauma work, and then stepped out and wanted to enhance. My long-term goal was always, providing service, most likely private practice. So I was trained in EMDR. And then as that happened, the universe opened, meeting some colleagues, and they were like, "We have this grant to work with first responders, but we don't know how to access them." I'm like, "Oh,
Mm.
me. I can access a lot of first responders for you.
Right.
Let's do this." So we did actually a great program, bringing together first responders from Long Island, actually probably some city ones as well, along with mental health therapy. So that really
Mhm.
became the bridge. And then um, got introduced to the World Trade Center Health Program and began treating folks from there. At that point, um, my husband and brother-in-law and others, friends, etc., had been experiencing health issues, mental health issues,
Right.
as they. So that's how I got into that component of it. So I'm pretty much with that. And I had already just like started in general, like I was or I am first responder competent therapist. When they talk their talk, I know it. My dad
Yeah.
had 64 years in the fire department. So like it's just common knowledge to me. So many people feel comfortable with that.
I was curious, like, you have such a unique perspective because you are dealing with first responders in your work, but also like every single minute of the day in your personal life. So, like, from your
Mm-hmm.
perspective, how has 9/11 shaped the mental health landscape of first responders and community members from both angles, I think?
Well, I think that's a very like broad question. I
Yeah.
think in the 9/11 community, I think there's a lot of impact in the World Trade Center. This Droga Act, provided access to medical care, mental health care, etc. Um, Many did not access that care, some still don't, and I'm constantly sort of wherever I am sort of like, wait, you were at 9/11, like, are you, registered, etc.
Right.
So I think there's a distinction. There's those who are aware and still committed in the 9/11 community. And then there's those who sort of see it from the outside. Oh, 9/11. Oh, you know, they're not, um, they might either, have some loose threads to it, or it's just, it is almost becoming another day to them. Where I would say personally, professionally, like it's never another day to me, and to many of the people that I work with, it's been the day that never ended. Um, in that, so many people died that initial day, but so many more have died since or been afflicted with different illnesses. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
No, yeah, I think like to be more specific, I'm curious in your experience, like what are the specific pressing mental health needs of the community that you've seen? like doing EMDR and like therapy? Like what have you seen that benefits the community the most?
Oh, I definitely think any sort of trauma focused care, whether it's EMDR, and I think just getting them to the room,
Mhm.
to acknowledge, validate. So many of them didn't, think even, 23 years ago, yes, AOL Messenger, but they didn't really believe in any sort of therapies either. I think the change in mental health, the acceptance of mental health has helped to facilitate it.
Mhm.
What, you know, I think there's a lot of common dynamics with, their own experience, their own traumatic experiences, their own intrusive thoughts, their own, triggers from, anything from, planes to being trapped in a grocery store or feeling trapped in a grocery store, which mimics when they were down searching and they got the bells ringing to get out, So I think for most people, it's very private. Um,
Yeah.
I think, it takes a lot of time. What we are seeing, which I think is fantastic, is we are now, the increase in people accessing the health program as well as the mental health program continues to grow. And what we're seeing now, or I'm seeing now in my practice at least, and for those who I communicate with that do this kind of work, receiving those who are now retired, um, but were in higher ranks then, lieutenants and captains, and
Mhm.
you those from the Navy who responded. Though it's all sorts of different, it's the responders, but it's also the survivors, and it's also the iron workers or different union trades that have response. So for them coming you know, in upper ages, to feel that there's a place to talk about this, that there's, they don't want to burden their family, their spouse, they don't talk about it at home. So to be able to come in, have that dialogue, um, to develop that relationship and then move into trauma treatment in terms of treating and resolving, some of the symptoms. Some of them return due to, other events, world events, etc.
Mm.
But having that place, definitely.
Yeah, and EMDR specifically is really interesting to me. One, because I do it myself and I've seen it
Hmm.
work so well. But for people who don't know what EMDR is, I'd love if you could explain kind of how it works and why you think it's particularly effective for something like this.
So EMDR is a, well researched treatment model that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And essentially what you're doing with either bilateral movements, tapping, or pulsars or eye movements, you're helping the mind and body to digest essentially the experiences that you had. So helping someone who was standing on a street corner while everything fell apart, literally,
Hmm.
worried about their own life, or, helping them digest that 18, 20 years later, really can make a significant shift. Like, so it mimics REM sleep. So many of the responders do have difficulty with sleep, nightmares, sleep disruption, and doing any piece of EMDR work on any of the triggers or points, or teaching them the mindfulness skills to sort of help regulate the body and brain, just helps them digest all this negative material.
I heard that you process life through REM sleep. So it's interesting that like
Yes.
you're
Yes. So it,
reprocessing.
right. So That's why it's called reprocessing. And yes,
Yeah.
I mean, even from the initial onset when Francine Shapiro, sort of came about in identifying this type of therapy, yes, so you might be in office with me and we're processing on a certain event, and it may have gone down in level of distress. And then, because the tapping or the bilateral stimulation mimics REM sleep, then what I tell you is that the processing may continue over the next several days until we meet each other. Notice, go back to the
Hmm.
self regulating skills, because your REM sleep is sort of digesting those fragments. So they may come back and be like, yeah, like I've slept this week better, or like, no, I'm struggling. And like, okay, then we might need to target something like that. But it is mimicking is the REM sleep. So different things like, the tapping and the eye movements, or just even getting out and doing a walk, is left right movements, which is how the brain synchronizes.
That's so interesting. And it's also has been really interesting because I've noticed that like when you reprocess something, it affects other things that you wouldn't think it would affect. And so like by doing an
Absolutely.
EMDR, you're like healing things you wouldn't think that you were healing from it, which is so
Right.
cool.
Yes. Or, and it, it can go back to different things, or you're like, and that was even my own first experience with EMDR. Like, I didn't really do like depth work, but we did process something. And I remember like months later, I'm like, I don't have that thing anymore. Like that
Yeah.
feeling that, and wow, you know, and, people do experience that with EMDR therapy. And it's, not only for responders, it can treat, you know, work with many different types of struggles.
Yeah. Um okay, so as someone from a family of first responders, how do you think and how have you observed that the family impacts the mental health of those who are first responders?
I think, you grow up in this culture of service, of responding. Um, there's many positives to it. There are a few negatives in terms of, self care and those kinds of things. I think it brings about a flexibility of people and their mindsets. Um, some families really struggle with it, in not understanding. Um, but it's been my whole life, so
Yeah.
my dad was in a fatal fire back in, I think it was 1977, on Thanksgiving Day. And we were listening, as bizarre as that is, we were listening to the scanner and then getting
Mm.
calls on who was going to the hospital and those pieces. And ultimately, there was two deaths from that fire. So when I was 7 at the time or whatever. So those were my first two funerals, because all
Wow.
my family babysitters were part of the fire department.
Wow.
So there's a lot of, connection, that spans lifetimes, and it becomes that family culture in most places for most people, not all. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting because I'm not a first responder, but I have family members who are EMTs, and it
Hmm.
was really interesting to kind of learn how they cope with things and like how they use humor to like
Hmm.
desensitize a little bit sometimes and
Hmm.
like
Oh, dark humor, gallows humor,
yeah.
absolutely. And like, so, you know, most therapists, or, people are like, what? How could you, respond that way? And it's like, "What? No, that's sort of, a way to cope, a way to deal. What we have learned over the years is the accumulation of those things are not healthy.
Yeah.
So, there's much more emphasis, and I work with, organizations that treat responders and vets, for some more intensive work, to really help those, because any one critical event um, can really alter someone's experience and sense of safety or trust or control, whatever it is. And treatment can, easily, most often easily, sort of get you on a new playing field. So,
Yeah. Do you have any advice for families who have first responders in their family, like how to support them in what they do?
I think, interesting, one of the programs that I do, um, you know, does include spouses, or partners, to really help them understand, the impacts of the work and why they may come home in an altered mood, or why they may
Mhm.
not want to share, So I do think that's an area that we could grow in. Definitely, that there is not enough support for spouses. Yes, I am
Mhm.
one. you know, but there are some programs out there that do include and do support. I think it's about educating yourself and um, supporting yourself, right? Like, I can see certain family members or certain extended family friends that really dislike their work, or dislike, or get fearful when they hear something. And of course, we all get fearful, but yet not respond to it, So,
Mhm.
managing their own, um, learning to sort of cope with where their loved one, whoever it may be, this is their passion, or this is their, career. And yes, bad things, they're going to see some bad things, they're going to,
Yeah.
be involved in things. So I think, I think also for the community of therapists out there, um, this is, there is a cultural competency to working with responders or their families. So
Mhm.
there was a time where, there was a responder who was having marital difficulty, and the other therapist, was, well, tell him not to do overtime, tell him to reduce his shifts, and it's not so easy in that line of work,
Yeah.
especially when there's a crisis or there's staffing shortages. So, how to help them cope, or really how to help the therapist understand that this is part of the culture. It stinks, you may do Christmas on a different day, you may do this on a different day, or they may not get home for this or that. If they can, they will, because I think, no, I know that uh, many are, if you have something, I'll cover for you. Next time I have something, you cover for me. So there is
Right.
a, culture of support for them. Um, there's more support in the police wives, I think, than the fire wives or EMTs,
Mhm.
um, in general. So it's enhancing in the support, but I think it involves, the need is more training. We've done some, I've done some with colleagues, in terms of just enhancing and understanding this culture. And some of the slides are on dark humor, gallows humor. Some of them
Mhm.
are, watching an officer in distress, like, meaning like them becoming dysregulated, and like really thinking about what might have happened, to them, with them, what was their last call, um, you know, working with them that, like, they may have had a child call, and, they go home and their child's in the same pajamas that that child was in.
Right.
And they don't want to say that to their wife, or spouse, partner, because, yeah, that's something they do, they recognize, or so that level of distress, we do need to provide more support. And, that goes along with encouraging anyone, male or female responder, to communicate with their partner, communicate with their family, when they are in a more difficult space, um, for whatever reason, you know. We know that
Yeah.
suicides are at epidemic proportion, um, and life is hard, and I think that many, recall 9/11 or know it as a historical event, yet the impacts or how that flushes out, um, most people aren't aware, whether they're local people or, speaking with a well-known Florida therapist at, a conference this year. She's like, I know you do 9/11 work. What is that? What is it? Who is still being treated? I'm like, oh my goodness, like, you need to know
Right.
about the, trade health program. You need these things. She is an EMDR therapist as well. So, like, you may have someone up the block that,
Mhm.
moved from New York to Florida, so, there's a lot of work around here, yet there are not many people in the business of doing this kind of treatment for responders.
Right.
um, that's what we keep trying to, some of my groups of peoples are trying to continue to grow people that are willing to sort of, work with these kinds of issues, because there is a lot of resiliency, there is a lot of hope, there is a lot of things that can be modified and changed, yet there's also very heavy things.
Yeah, I mean, even just the things I hear from my family members who are EMTs, like when they do communicate things of like they helicoptered a baby who didn't make it. Like I can't
Hmm.
imagine what that feels like to go home after
Hmm.
that, and they come home
Right.
and they laugh it off because that's what they have to do to kind of like
Hmm.
go to work the next
Right.
day. But I can't imagine like the level of heaviness it gets that they don't communicate sometimes.
Right, right. And the impacts that that takes on the brain and body,
Mhm.
the amount of, substance abuse and addiction that we have seen in, the 9/11 population, as well as concurrently with the first responder, because it becomes a way to cope or sleep, or I can't think, I keep seeing that baby on the helicopter and I need to get myself to sleep because I have to be able to function.
Yeah.
Um, so, not that we condone that, like, we teach healthier, experiences, but, yet it's continuing the education out there that, it's okay to not be okay, in any of these
Yeah.
experiences. And I think that's where, um, so often I feel like the message is lost with 9/11. That there are certain things that will come up, legislation or pieces, yet in the day to day. So, for example, I teach at one of the universities and I, uh, landed up with a class on 9/11, and I can't go into a classroom and not acknowledge 9/11. You know, many schools, many places have sort of, moved memorials or not done it, but, like, I had to open a discussion on obviously all the things, right? And
Mhm.
including their own stories. And, most of them were younger, but remember being pulled out of school and the fear and the anxiety, and, teaching them that there is this whole population of responders and people of service, nurses, doctors, everyone who has been impacted, lapping it in with COVID nowadays, right? Like,
Yeah.
the work we did during COVID was many of these responders, many of the EMS from the streets who were,
Mhm.
you know, um, pronouncing people or doing different things. So, helping them to sort of look at those components of, how clinical work, right? Because I'm teaching a clinical course, different things that can come in, and that are very much alive. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great segue to my next question, which has to do with kind of like the future of treating large scale disasters like 9/11 and COVID, and your from your perspective, what changes do you think need to be made to better address the needs of people affected by 9/11, COVID?
I mean, my personal opinion is, I think, John Field and his team and what they did to advocate to get treatment and care, and the continued work that they do, is absolutely amazing. Like, where would we be, in terms of like people not getting help and falling further into the things, the depression, the trauma, the addictions. Um, so I think that is one way to, like, we have to look at, what are our responsibilities as a country, as, an
Yeah.
area to address, look at all of the, Hurricane Helene, and all the devastating, uh, dynamics there.
Hmm.
There is not a lot of, I think we learned it in 9/11 and we've seen it since. Um, there's not a lot of formal systems for the mental health components. There is, you know, uh, some disaster relief support, yet that is not really treatment. So
Right.
like we need to build a structure of steps, to have people be able to access care. I mean, that's a huge issue just in general, like for regular mental health, if someone has a
Right.
tragedy, and but definitely on the large scale pieces. And some of them, it's interesting, to witness the doors that are open and doors that are closed. And what I mean by that is institutions or organizations that will either say, like, we need help, can you work with this? And then, getting some folks together and intervening and doing, just even some preliminary work and get them referred out, as well as, just creating the structure to have other pathways and having the people that are able to do this work and
Hmm.
you know have some expertise really lead. Yet I think there's also, a dynamic of this few and far between that want to go into this kind of work. You're seeing the drop offs in numbers of police people who want to be police officers, EMS, first responders, all of those things,
Yeah.
because there is much more education around the impacts of this kind of work. So, and then the institutional, support or lack of support, and that could go for big organizations and that can go for little programs as well. Um,
Yeah. I mean, to your point, like we need a better foundation in general for all of this, but I think like
mm.
specifically for first responders, like I don't know what it looks like every day, but like having therapists more involved in like an everyday capacity at these places would be really interesting. I don't know if they already do that. Maybe they do.
Some do, some don't. I'd probably be more of an advocate based on my experiences with these populations to be able to take it out of the workplace, right? That,
Yeah.
so because if you're in the workplace or if I'm employed by the same employer, it can become sticky.
Oh yeah,
So
that's true.
now that's not to say that EAP programs or like getting people referrals or getting an initial pieces, yes, those are pieces that we need, yet getting them out for the help. and having the experience to know and recommend and connect. I definitely find that those who send my programs, the referrals, are those who either know me or know there's some knowledge there, that there's some a comfort level. So it's building bigger networks. I mean, just to sort of go in as a little piece that sticks in my craw, and you can understand why, is the initial bills did not include EMS. New York City EMS did not include court officers, did not include so many. So many other, there was certain unions that weren't included. Volunteer fire departments were included for coverage for
Wow.
years, so it wasn't until we brought it before senators, and I
Mhm.
say we because it was my husband and I and some others that really knocked on the door and said, this is not okay. There's people out here suffering with medical conditions and mental health conditions, and they should be included. I mean, how New York City EMS was not included is just
Crazy.
right. Right. So, and there was a woman that testified in that Senate hearing that we sat next to, and, a few weeks later, she was gone from breast cancer from 9/11.
Wow.
But she wanted to make sure her voice was heard. And God bless her, because it's people who make the difference. And I think that is um, the message to the larger structure, is you have to show up and do it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay, before we head into this kind of lighter round of questions, I wanted to just pause and see if there anything else you wanted to touch on that we didn't talk about regarding your work or 9/11.
I guess the only other thing I think we spoke about when we met was the need to continue to educate about the World Trade Center health program, continue to get
Mhm.
people involved and accessing that care, breaking down the barriers of like, oh, I'm not sick, I don't need to go. Like, go do your physical. And if all you do is your yearly physical, there are so many cancers and there's so many illnesses that impact this population 23 years later, just still coming up with new things like, oh, and, there's great research coming out of the programs. So just more advocacy around getting people registered and in the program. I'm happy to see, like, I think it's strange to see the numbers still climbing of people enrolling, and, happy to see those who, were more in the trenches then or in leadership then now realizing they need something.
Right.
And obviously, the end all answer of if you experience just a blanket statement of if you experience something that is traumatic or overwhelming to you and your nervous system, to seek out support, trauma care. Like, the quicker you get to things and respond to things, the less it has to impact your brain and body.
Yeah,
So, providing
absolutely.
more of that emergency, emergent care.
Yeah, and we'll link the World Trade Center application in the description of
Hmm.
this, and if there's any other
Hmm.
links, we can chat after, and I can link them as well.
Yes.
But I think
Perfect. Yep.
that's
Absolutely.
super
Hmm.
super important. Um, okay, so some lighter stuff. Let's see. First question, I guess, what's the most beautiful thing you've learned in doing this work?
Just from the depths of darkness to the light of hope, to watch people, go through that transformation, post traumatic growth, whatever it is. And I am someone who's always been sort of more hopeful. I don't give up hope. Like, there's always hope, to continue to address these things. So, to see some of the recovery, to see, people understand this, to see the advances made in some of the treatments, there's so many things to be grateful for. And, and just even the for me the connections in this community, like like intimate connections, when you're sharing some of this dark deep stuff, there's an intimate level of connection, and to see the light in someone's eyes go from dark to light, or brighter, or I don't feel that way anymore, or remember when I used to this, when I wasn't able
Mhm.
to get out of the house and only, have sessions virtually, or, now they're out and about or volunteering or doing other things. That's the resilience, that's the growth. Um,
I love that. Number 2, what is giving you the most energy right now?
I guess again the continued hope, in the direction of future treatment. I love the programs that I work with that are intervening, you know, on these post critical incidents, that are giving people a place and a space to come together confidentially, to be able to dip their toe into something that, you know, is, has been impacting their worlds. So some of that work is really the hope. Program is in several states. It continues to grow, and I think, yeah, that that we're seeing more acceptance around all of these issues for
Yeah.
first responders in any capacity. That there's a realization on how many traumatic incidents they see, and it doesn't matter. It's what the person's perception of an event is. It doesn't matter if it was that kid got on the helicopter and survived. It may have just been seeing that kid in that condition, or it may have been so giving opportunity for them to process their events, making space, and hoping and praying that more colleagues, pick up this work, because there's enough of it.
Yeah, definitely. That leads us into our last one, which is a very vague question. It's what's something exciting you have planned for this year, but maybe it's more of like, is there anything exciting with the programs you're working on that are coming up in the next year?
um, it is to continue to definitely do this work, to find a way to continue to build other clinicians in these areas, which is challenging in a lot of ways, although we have some things. So it is really to continue to find a path to continue to serve this population, because you know I see it on the home front, the extended family front, the need from it. I see it on those who walk into my office, or those who I casually get to talk to in different spaces and places. So yeah, just continuing that work, continuing to let it grow, to get more people registered for a program, to help their families in that way. And I would love to be involved in something more global to look at exactly how we do this. One thing I didn't get to address, and I think I was going to say it before, and then went across my mind, was the limiting of licensing.
Mm,
If I wanted to do any work, even pro bono work in North Carolina or in Tennessee right now, I have a license barrier.
right. Yeah.
Same thing. I have someone who, and this is my second one, we're going to have to figure it out, someone who travels internationally from 9/11. My license doesn't extend that way. So freeing up some of those pieces, or a way to have, those things not be as complicated.
Yeah, I mean, especially in like a post-COVID world, like there it doesn't make I mean, besides the way it's set up and however they do it monetarily, but like logistically it doesn't make sense because I can't see my therapist if I go to like California for the week. And it's like, why?
Right.
Like there's Zoom,
Right.
like there's ways that you can do it.
Correct. And it's really the antiquated licensing regulations,
Yeah.
and who gets paid, and fears of certain states. Well, too many New York therapists come in and want to treat patients from Kansas or Tennessee. And like, look, folks, in this
Fear-based,
world,
yeah.
right, in this world, there's not going to come that space.
Yeah. Yeah, if there's a shortage of people to be treated, then that's a good problem to have.
Right. Yeah. I would. Okay. So there's no more people in the. Great. Like, okay, my job is done and I can be done, Yet
Exactly.
that's not the case. That's not the case. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for so much for doing this work. It's so, so important. And also for coming on the podcast. It's such a unique perspective, I think, that a lot of people will find a lot of value in. So thank you so much again.
No, I appreciate it. Appreciate the platform or opportunity to speak things out, sometimes that you just don't have the opportunity to speak out and, remind people that there are supports, there are programs for 9/11 still running, for a family member, for everything, that
Mhm.
there is, continue, many families continue to walk through life, and
Yep.
healing is part of that life.
Well, thank you so much.